Hello and a warm welcome to this brand new Sustainability Education podcast. I'm Dr. Stefan Siegel, postdoc researcher at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. In sustainability education, ideas and assumptions exist that sound plausible, but that are at least questionable or even dangerous at a closer look. In this podcast, I want to discuss myths and facts about sustainability education and the things in between. For this purpose, I invite world-leading experts on environmental and sustainability education, educational psychology, and myth and misinformation research. This podcast series is part of the research project Identifying, Understanding, and Challenging Myths in and about Sustainability Education. My vision is a more evidence-informed, effective, and ethically responsible sustainability education, and I hope to push the boundaries of knowledge in this field. I would be most delighted if you listened in and joined our conversation. You can do so on all the usual podcast platforms. Enjoy listening. I'm most delighted to have Professor Dr. Kerry Shephard with me in today's episode of the Sustainability Education podcast. Kerry is a professor at the Higher Education Development Center at the University of Otago in New Zealand. Kerry's academic journey began in biology, where he spent 25 years in research and teaching. For the last 20 years, he has been researching in higher education, focusing on the questions of how university functions and how learning happens in this domain. His research interests include policy and practice in higher education, environmental and sustainability education, and the affective domain of learning. He's author of numerous journal articles, book chapters, and author and editor of various books, such as Higher Education for Sustainability or Universities with a Social Purpose. He is also a regular reviewer for a wide range of higher education journals. Kerry has extensive experience as a university teacher and offers courses on academic leadership, critical thinking, and intellectual independence. Since Kerry is involved in both sustainability education and higher education, I'm very excited for this conversation. Welcome, Kerry. Where are you joining us from today?
Thank you, Stefan. So yes, I'm sitting in my office at the University of Otago in Dunedin, in South Island, New Zealand.
Thanks for being here. Let's start without further ado with the first thematic area, understanding sustainability education and educational myths. Educational myths and sustainability education could currently be considered hot topics in educational research. What comes to mind when you hear those terms, myths in and about sustainability education?
Oh, so much comes to my mind, and it's likely to come out in a sort of a torrent of confusion. In terms of sustainability education, I think one of the primary dichotomies that we have to deal with is education about sustainability as opposed to education for sustainability, and I'm sure aspects of that will come out further in the podcast interview. In terms of myths, I probably wouldn't use that term myself. I'm happy for you to use it, but For me, I think often the contestation and the confusion is explainable in terms of, for example, people coming from different disciplines. My experience is that people who come from science simply don't understand some aspects of education. They may think of themselves as educators in science and may be extraordinarily experienced as higher education lecturers or professors, but the amount of knowledge and the feel for the discipline of education is something different. And I suspect the same occurs. People who come from the discipline of education probably struggle to address some of the disciplinary features of some of our work. Now, I would extend that confusion not just between disciplines, but between nations and perhaps more particular between languages. I have struggled to understand what some of my German and Scandinavian colleagues call Bildung. It might be that I don't want to understand it, and I think that half of Europe is just confused about reality. But I'm not going to call it a myth, and hopefully they won't identify my stance on some of the issues as myth-like. Competence is a simple word, but it's profoundly misunderstood between nations, between languages. Again, my European colleagues seem to have an entirely mythical perception of the concept of competence. And of course, it's a different word. In German, it begins with a K. It has a different history. And just in common usage, it's causing huge problems in what we might call the discipline of education for sustainable development, if it is a discipline. So all sorts of communication issues that I think cause people to think of one way of thinking about the problems as a myth and another way as something that has more substance. If I were to grasp at something which I think universally was a myth, it would be the myth that we can actually change people's behavior simply through knowledge, or simply through telling them what they should be doing, or it's an absurdity that we think we can do that. And the key to me is measurement. I'm quite a fan of the Carnegie Institute in the USA and the concept of learning science. One of the key concepts that comes through that domain is you can't improve something unless you can measure it. If you can't measure it, then you're just talking all sorts of things about it and around it. We have to, if we are going to have anything to do with education for something, we have to be able to identify what the for is for and find ways of measuring it. It just doesn't make sense to me. And anything that tries to cause change by just having opinions about how people should change their education or change this, that, or the other is just mythical from my standpoint.
A lot of what you said resonates with me quite well. But what I wonder, if you refrain from using the term myths, I also do that in my research. I use it for the purpose that it's kind of a catchy word, a catchy term.
No,
but in my research, I often use the word questionable beliefs instead, or questionable assumption, because it's not so absolute as fact and myth. So the gray zone in between there is leaves more open space for discussion and debate.
But one of the things that's important to me, you see, was before we started our conversation, I needed to know where you came from. And not just your nation and your language, but your disciplinary background, because that helps me tremendously in terms of the way that I might be communicating with you. Now, we've already established that you're an educator by background. You studied education and you practice education and you research education. My background is different. I was a scientist. I went to university, studied zoology and botany, and got into it. My interest in environmental sustainability came from that route, and it's been a struggle for me to understand my new discipline of education. It's a work in progress. Without a doubt, I still struggle over some educational concept, but also perhaps I'm arrogant enough to think that I have some advantages. So I'm going to describe one advantage for you. One of my advantages. I studied ethology as a biologist. Ethology is the study of animal behavior. A really important aspect of learning about how animals behave is to understand learning and the nature of learning. And what you can't do with an animal is put them in an exam hall and give them an exam and ask them if they've learned something. The only way we can follow learning in the animal world is through changes in behavior. For me, the concept that learning is a change of behavior is automatic. I don't need to struggle with that, a change of behavior. And you try and translate that into a different discipline where people haven't studied animal behavior, and their idea about learning is something different. And the idea, even learning as change, is a struggle for some people. But for me, I'd go further, a change of behavior. We might say, well, the change of behavior is they can answer an exam question better after they've learned it than they could before. But when we're dealing with sustainability, we need to know what sort of behavioral changes we're really talking about. What are we really interested in? And I doubt learning that doesn't have a change of behavior. I doubt learning and even research that doesn't explore changes of behavior. So I think I have a huge advantage with my scientific background, but I absolutely understand it creates tensions between the various disciplines that come together in this international and interdisciplinary pursuit of education for sustainable development.
I think that's a very valid point you mentioned. In the last decades, various notions of environmental and sustainability education have been developed. Environmental education, education for sustainable development, sustainability education, regenerative education, etc. Is sustainability education simply old wine in new wineskins, or does it represent something fundamentally different approach to teaching and learning?
Yeah, I'm going to show my age here. The older you are, the more bandwagons you experience that people jump on. And when the same bandwagon comes back, you think, oh, 30 years ago, that was a thing. And I think another a feature of age is to have more confidence in what came before than perhaps young people would have. There is a tendency to think that if it's new and it's in a recently published article in a journal, it must be fantastic. But my experience tells me that most of what's published nowadays is published by people who didn't bother to read what was published before. In a way, I know that because that is me. To try and find the time to read a modern book is just so difficult as an academic. Absolutely. Nowadays, to find time to read books that were published in the 1950s and 1960s because they might be relevant is almost impossible. And yet, without that background in educational science, I really struggle to see how we can make progress. Over and over again, I see things being reinvented, new names applied to them, and they are basically the same concepts, but with different names. Either now or in a few minutes, I can provide an example, I guess.
Yeah.
So just imagine this. So more than 20 years ago, an environmental scientist, probably an environmental physiologist more than an ecologist, but deeply interested in environmental protection. And even in those days, probably not. Sustainability wasn't my thing. Environmental education probably was my thing. I found myself in a position where I wanted to know more about teaching and learning than the research into the biology that I was doing. And I started to find myself in a position where I actually got research money to research my teaching and struggled to get research money to research my major academic interests in biology. So the transition was fairly straightforward for me. I became Learning Technologies Coordinator at the University of Southampton in the UK. And I thought, this is great. I'm going to write this book now that perhaps I've had on my mind for a long time, all about educating for sustainability. And I started writing chapters and initially thought this is good because what I'm doing is combining my knowledge of biology and my newfound knowledge of education, and it should all fit together really well. And it really didn't. I found myself absolutely able to write chapters about sustainability or about the environment, but really struggled to even comprehend how it could possibly be for sustainability. How can I possibly be trying to describe an education process that changes people? Other than by giving them more knowledge and more information. I mean, what is that my role? I'm luckily I had a mentor. His name he's passed now, but Hayden Mathias, and he took me into his office. And I wasn't a young academic at that time, but he realised my background was science and not education, and he pulled this dusty book, literally. He pulled this dusty book off of a dusty shelf, and he brushed it off. And it was a 1964 volume of not Bloom's taxonomy, but the second one, Catherall M. Bloom's taxonomy of learning in the affective domain. And to say that moment changed my life is an understatement. I read about aspects of education that I'd never even comprehended before. The thought that there's more to education than what goes on in a cognitive sense. The idea of what was then known as values, attitudes, and behaviours being an aspect of education that really we need to think about. And one thing just it's all as if one thing just cascaded into another thing, and it was as if the blinkers had been taken off my eyes, and a new set of concepts that enabled me to understand not only how to write the book, which took me another 20 years to write, but also how to understand the dilemmas of education for sustainability as it was then, and now education for sustainable development. We're fundamentally working in the affective domain. We might call the affective name all sorts of different things. We might be struggling with dispositions. We might be talking about emotional connections. But everything here I see now through the lenses that particular book and that particular age gave me. I haven't found anything that replaces it. I found lots of other things where people have re-identified some of the original ideas, renamed them, come up with new bandwagons that sort of fit around this. But essentially, we're talking about values education here, just as they were in the 1960s, but with difficulty. Just values education was difficult in the 1960s. It's difficult now.
So this sounds like a very critical incident for your career or your understanding of education. And I saw on your website that in your publications that this affective domain is very important to you as an educator and as a researcher. When I look at, for instance, transformative education or regenerative education, you could get the impression that environmental education or sustainability education is kind of a dead end. Can you quickly give me your stance on that? Shall we refrain from engaging in sustainability or environmental education?
Yes and no. I wouldn't be one that tells people to refrain from any sort of education. So if I sort of, I'm getting beyond the dichotomies here and introducing something different. So, for example, there are many people that call for transformative education because they think that more traditional education isn't working. But I think traditional education is doing fantastic things. So perhaps I would identify the biggest problem that our planet has is the number of people on it. And the number of people on it depends on birth rates. And I was very impressed when I first started teaching back in, when I had my first teaching job, I was teaching a course called Human Nutrition and Food. And one of the things that jumped out to me there was a statistic that looked at the relationship between population expansion and level of education. And in the 1970s and 80s, that relationship became absolutely clear. And I don't think anything's changed since then. The higher the level of education, the lower the birth rate, particularly if we educate women. There's something absolutely, I mean, it's gone way beyond a correlation. You know, there's just so much there that supports that idea. So to say that traditional education isn't working, I don't think is right. Traditional education is having a profound effect, and we need more of it. You know, we don't. It doesn't need to be at university level. Probably the statistics will still come through if we educate everybody up to primary level. Reasonable standards of literacy, reasonable standards of numeracy, reasonable, just the beginnings of science education, plus good media, good internet and things like that. And we will transform the world. We won't achieve what perhaps we need to achieve, but to say it's not working, I don't think it's right. Now, then we get on to these ideas of transformational education that fit within the broad category of education for anything. So education for sustainability. We really are talking about some element of transformation. It's a widely used phrase. And I don't think of it as a myth. I don't think of it as a dead end. I'd love it to work. I think it would be fantastic if it would work. I call it Plan A, ESD Plan A. My own research back in 2012, I think, I worked with a colleague at the University of Otago, and we used Q methodology to get to grips with the different perspectives that university teachers had around education for sustainability at the time and their role in it. And absolutely clear, we found 4 different conceptions. Only one of them thought it was reasonable for universities to be teaching education for sustainability. The 4 was a huge issue. It's qualitative research, it's not quantitative. I can't tell you what proportion of people feel one thing or the other, but I would say, you know, my benefit of experience now, 90% of people in universities don't think they want to be for anything in particular other than their discipline. So any form of transformation, any form of educational transformation, it's almost as if it's going to have to be done despite the academics that exist in our universities, rather than with them. And again, you know, I wish it well. I'd love it to work. I want to see it evaluated. I want to see I want to see some examples of how it's working. I see it's almost inevitable in compulsory education because most countries say that's what school teaching got to do. It's got to educate people to adopt the values of the society, be they democracy or sustainability. So school teachers, I think, are in a really tough position. Academic universities, less so because they have more choice.
This reminds me a little bit of Stephen Sterling's statement that education and educational systems are sometimes slow learners.
Well, but perhaps, but again, it's this notion Well, to challenge to Stephen and go back to Pedagogy 101, there has to be a motivational context for learning. To accuse people of being slow learners when what's at issue here is they don't want to learn that. That's not their job. And to say they're slow learners, I think it's just downright rude. So it's a little bit like me, talking about myths. I don't want to claim anybody's sort of way of doing this is a myth, but I think we need to evaluate these different processes and not call each other names.
Yeah.
Now, then I come to perhaps sort of getting away from the dichotomy, my own thoughts around intellectual independence. So I call this Plan B, and I say, well, look, I'd love Plan A to work, but actually we can't sit back and wait for Plan A to work. Higher education's got to be doing something useful, something positive in this broad domain.
Maybe quickly for the potential listeners, with the dichotomy, you refer, if I got it correctly, to ESD1 and ESD2, like ESD1, Education for Sustainable Development, one where you convey transmissively content about sustainable related topics. Whereas with ESD2, you foster more the competencies like critical thinking or systems thinking that helps to address the grand challenges we face today.
Well, I think that is a fine dichotomy and probably relates to the difference between my ESD Plan A and my ESD Plan B. The dichotomy that I was actually referring to was the difference between traditional education and all of these calls that we're confronted by now that suggest that education should transform people. So, and I think put it on the table. There's been a long-standing debate about the role of education as being essentially instrumental or emancipatory. And I hope it will become clear that my ethos is entirely around the emancipatory side of things. But I'm not suggesting that it's the solution to our problems. What I am suggesting is that we've got to find some way of higher education having some sort of positive impact towards something that most people realize is a problem. Most people realize that the world is in a difficult situation right now. There are, I say most people, because some people just, they just cherish the fact that people are living longer and healthier lives in most parts of the world now than they used to. I know there are wars and all sorts of other terrible things happening, but on balance, sort of things aren't that bad for people. But then when we start looking at things like global warming, from my particular interests in relation to environmental protection, habitat destruction, soil salinization, bleaching of the corals, it just goes on. Then most people, we've just got problems here. And to think that universities can't be part of the solution, it's we just can't entertain that thought. So if universities are going to be part of the solution, what we need to do is to get them to do what they already say they're good at doing, but do it better. And I think universities, almost all universities, they say we're good at teaching people to think critically. I like New Zealand's particular take on it. So one aspect of our legislation is that the principal aim of our universities should be to develop intellectual independence. And I didn't write that. It came up in the 1989 Education Act. It was reconfirmed in the 2020 Education and Training Act. And it seems to me to be fundamental to the purpose of the university. I see intellectual independence we think of intellectual independence as the principal aim. That means it's not an aim amongst many other aims. It's the principal aim. And it means you can't have other aims taking precedence over it. So if the principal aim is to develop intellectual independence, it can't be at the same time to develop democracy or to develop sustainability or to develop honesty or, these may be all wonderfully worthy attributes that universities may or may not be interested in developing. But what we've got to do is to develop intellectual independence. And that's my mission. I didn't discover the legislation until I was well and truly into my personal mission, which at that time I'd framed as critical thinking. But for me, critical thinking has a lot in common with intellectual independence. Just about every academic I meet tells me that they develop critical thinking. and we ought to be doing it better than we do at present. So plan B is not an alternative to plan A. It's not an alternative to traditional forms of education. It's just get on with what we tell the world we do, but let's find out how well we do it, and let's carry on doing it better than we do at present, and let's see where it takes us.
Super, super interesting. I also think that intellectual independence could be a very sustainable learning outcome in itself, because if you just tell people what to do, what values they should have, what behaviors they should show, that might work for a certain time, but it might not be sustainable in itself. So I very like this notion of intellectual independence as a foundation principle. Let's move on to the second thematic area, exploring the questionable beliefs. Let's maybe phrase it like that, about sustainability education further. When you think of your decades of experience in research and practice in biology, but also in higher education, what are some of the most pervasive questionable assumptions that you have encountered regarding sustainability education? Are there certain myths that you have found more common?
I think I've probably mentioned some on the way. I think the idea of developing change without having clear perspectives of what change we want and how we're going to measure it. How will we know whether we are achieving change or not? So this is, for me, this is bringing evaluation science into whatever we call what we're doing here. And I think many disciplines find evaluation problematic. The big issue here, and I'm sure it relates to something that will come up in a minute, is that some things are quite difficult to measure So I tend to have this phrase: we want to see a change, perhaps a change in behaviour, but we've got to be able to assess it, or evaluate it, or monitor it, or measure it, or at the very least, we need to be able to research it. And for me, that opens up all sorts of different ways to get to grips with it. But without some clear thinking in those areas, then I think we have problems. I think we do have some clear thinking in the broad area of critical thinking. So if we say, well, actually, our challenge is not to produce people who will be sustainable. Our challenge is something different. So, for example, we've already talked about the roles of compulsory education. Maybe our challenge is to not mess it up. Maybe to get whatever compulsory education manages to achieve. Our role is to just not mess it up and change people's perspectives with something else. And I think that is probably a worthy goal in some respects. But the thought that we could develop some sort of transformatory change without clarity in terms of the behavioural changes that we're looking for, it just seems alien to me. It just doesn't seem a worthwhile practice. And what it makes for me is difficult reading when I look at institutional strategies and some of these big international agreements, like the Talwa Declaration. There's all these people, wonderful people with honest intentions. They've all agreed to, for example, educate for environmentally responsible citizenship. What does it mean? How can you promise to do that and then not do it, or not even ask the questions? There's a degree of dishonesty there, but I don't want to call people dishonest in that way, because I'm sure they had honest intentions. But without this sort of notion of we have to evaluate our progress, or at the very least, we need to research our practices. To make promises in the form of some sort of strategy or international commitment just doesn't seem reasonable. It doesn't seem worthy of higher education to me.
Yeah. But what do you think? What is missing there? Is it like operationalization of big words like systems thinking or critical thinking, so that to narrow it down and then to really track changes in people, behaviors and behavior potentials? Sometimes, as you alluded to it, it's difficult to measure, for instance, development in values. Of course, there are certain ways to do that. You could give them reflection papers, do simulations, etc. But sometimes it's really difficult to get at value changes, for instance. What would be your take on that?
Again, it's a sort of a complex question there. But to come back to the second example, you're speaking as somebody from the discipline of education. You didn't need to read Bloom et al. 1956, or Cathrall, Bloom and Massat in 1964, because it was either explicit or implicit within your education. It's perfectly capable. We're quite capable of assessing in the affective domain, but there are limitations there. we struggle to assess individuals in that domain. But why does education have to be so focused on individuals? Do we really matter as an institution? Let's say the institution of higher education. Does it really matter if Robert or Susan get an A+ in affective learning? I don't think it does. What matters to the institution of higher education, what matters to perhaps to each individual university, is on balance, are we having a positive effect on something that we aim for, or a negative effect? And how do we know these things? So as soon as you take away the individual assessment and you start to think, well, I can assess the whole cohort, or I can research the whole of the institution, then assessment, evaluation, monitoring, measurement, and research, they all become possible in the affective domain. But we're hung up on individuals. And I understand it's important to Robert how well he gets, because it's important to Robert's employers. It's probably important to Robert's parents as well. But we're too hung up on assessing individuals, and we don't take our responsibility for, in a way, assessing ourselves. We make these promises, we make these commitments, we have these wonderful lists of graduate attributes, but we don't bother researching our practice enough to know how well we're doing. So for me, these are absolutely there's a degree of arrogance, I think, that we have to overcome.
I'd like to ask you a personal question, if I may.
Yeah.
Truth be told, if you think back to the beginning of your professional biography, what questionable beliefs or assumptions did you yourself have about environmental or sustainability education? What was maybe the most important misconception you had, and what did you help overcome it?
Probably I've identified myself as an environmental educator, teaching in the broad area of environmental science, and without knowing enough about the discipline of education to do it justice. I think, like many other environmental educators, I thought if we taught enough about something, then it would cause some sort of change in behaviour. You used the term critical incidents. Perhaps I thought that my teaching would provide the critical incidents. It didn't. I think teaching in lectures, it's very difficult to provide people with critical incidences. So I'm hugely guilty of a misconception that related entirely to my disciplinary background.
Mm-hmm. So that our frontal lobe can do the heavy lifting by thinking through it, that more knowledge basically will do the trick, if I got that correctly.
Well, I didn't use those words, but that was the misconception that I think was implicit within my behaviour for nearly 3 decades of teaching. Yeah. So there's honesty for you, I hope. Yeah.
Absolutely. When I look at myself and my teaching, I often find at least questionable beliefs that my past practices were based on. But I do wonder, where do these misconceptions come from? Is it just a lack of knowledge in a certain domain, or has it other influences like societal factors that contribute to the formation of these questionable beliefs?
Gosh, to answer that question, I'd be in danger of suggesting that I have the solution to the problem, because as soon as you start identifying other people's beliefs as questionable, it's almost an assumption there that my beliefs aren't questionable. But of course, anybody who's listening to this podcast should be thinking, oh, Kerry's coming at it from a particular angle, but it might not be the right angle. And I've already identified perhaps my plan B, intellectual independence. One of the most questionable assumptions that people would be quite right to identify there is, well, how do you know that all these intellectually independent, critically thinking people will choose a sustainable pathway? How do you know they just won't use their incredible skills that you and people like you have managed to get them to acquire? How do you know they just won't use it to line their own pockets or to support the future of their dependents? And of course, I don't know that.
Better vandals of the earth, as David Orr would say.
They could be really good at it. And the only proper response I've got to that is that if we're really worried that intellectually independent people might vandalize the earth, perhaps we'd better not teach them to be intellectually independent. And as far as I can see, that is ESD Plan A. Back to a dichotomy, the universities have often said, we don't teach people what to think, we teach them how to think. I think Plan B is all about teaching people how to think, and it's risky. But for goodness sake, teaching people what to think. But that absolutely is the role of compulsory education, and in my view, absolutely isn't the role for higher education. And there we go. Yeah. But questionable beliefs, yeah, absolutely. I'm sure lots of people will listen to this and say Plan B is very questionable. It's based on all sorts of assumptions and hopes that just might prove to be dreadful.
What do you think, what could be consequences of questionable beliefs about sustainability education on educators, students, and the broader society? For instance, if lecturers think, sustainability education has nothing to do with my subject. For instance, if a math lecturer at the university in higher education says, well, sustainability education is all fine and well, I can understand that from your education background, but it has nothing to do with mathematics.
Yeah. So I have thought a lot about this, and fundamentally, I think the questionable attribute within that line of thinking is to think that by not addressing sustainability or by not addressing critical thinking or something like that, we can have a neutral effect. We can just teach our discipline, and this has nothing to do with the future of the planet. I'm just teaching my discipline. Go away. I don't need to address all of these other things. From my perspective, and based on my, what I've learned about learning in the affective domain, is that we learn from people around us all the time. Those people might not think they're teaching values, but they are teaching values. There's no way to have an interaction with somebody without having some sort of influence on them. I've become quite fascinated by the work of Bourdieu, and I wish I'd encountered or discovered or spent the time to learn what Bourdieu was talking about 20 years ago. The idea of people developing a second nature, which is a whole cacophony of different dispositions as a result of the experiences that they have in their life. And it produces that person. And it is such a powerful thinking tool. It's absolutely incredible. But for me, if we've got a university that says, we're nothing to do with that, we don't have any influence on that, it's just totally naive. And this is where evaluation is absolutely essential. We need to understand what impacts we're having. We can't possibly change these impacts that we're having unless we understand what impacts we're having. We've got to research our practices. And fundamentally, this is the issue that we have. As I say quite often, higher education researches everybody else's practices, but steadfastly refuses to research its own. I've published an article just recently on identity protection. And, again, we were talking about ideas being sort of reinvented or redeveloped. Identity protection isn't my idea. It's from the research that's already published. But I absolutely see higher education being frightened of affect, pretending that it doesn't have anything to do with affect, protecting the identity of itself and of its people by not evaluating or assessing or monitoring or measuring or researching affective outcomes. And this is almost, I would say, an almost universal affliction, identity protection. I see it in particular in my colleagues in departments of education. I'm saying that with a smile, which Stefan can see, but on the podcast they won't. People protect their identity, and there are certain attributes, certain behaviours, certain ways of working that higher education is proud of. It's always done it, and yet to pretend it's not having an impact on the next generation is just foolish. And again, it's a sort of a mark of arrogance to me. We have to assess, evaluate, monitor, measure, or research our impact. Personally, I think our impact in higher education on balance around the world is negative in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals or in relation to almost any measure of sustainability that we might have. So personally, I suspect it's a negative impact at present, and we've got a long way to go to convert that into some sort of positive effect.
And why do you think that is?
I don't think we're very good at teaching critical thinking. I'm staking a lot on intellectual independence and critical thinking. If I thought we were good at doing it, then I probably wouldn't be thinking that we're having a negative effect. I think we talk a lot about critical thinking. Most academics don't think of critical thinking in the way that I do. Most academics don't have a reasonable way of assessing the level of critical thinking that's going on. I'm not even sure that critical thinking is the right word or the right phrase. I prefer intellectual independence. We've got a lot of research to do to figure out how to achieve it. I did do quite a lot of research, perhaps the first 10 years of my newfound identity as somebody who was interested in affect and change in education. Perhaps the first 10 years was spent exploring ways to measure change. I became quite fascinated by this little tool called the NEP, the New Environmental Paradigm Scale. But it's one of many scales that people are using, and they're all flawed, of course. But I and colleagues at the University of Otago worked quite hard with groups of students to try and monitor change using a particular instrument in a particular way. We developed a longitudinal approach to be able to follow individuals. If I had to use a phrase, I would say sustainability concern. Back in the 1970s, the instrument was thought to measure or monitor environmental concern, but nowadays I think sustainability concern there is a reasonable identification of what the thing measures. And we really struggled to monitor positive change. That's not to say it didn't occur, because any sort of measurement device is going to have problems. Every measurement device I've ever encountered has got problems. But I ended that period of research with not a lot of confidence that the impact of universities at present is particularly positive.
I also read that in your publications and also listened to your podcast where you give the same impression. If we move on to another thematic area, one main goal of my postdoctoral research is to develop a sustainability education mythology. Lidienfeld and colleagues, psychologists, coined the term psychomatology to represent the vast body of misconceptions, urban legend, and old wives' tales regarding psychology. And I wonder, with your years of experience in research and practice in higher education, as well as sustainability education, environmental education, which questionable beliefs would you include in such a compilation of questionable assumptions in and about sustainability education?
Probably I wouldn't frame it like that. So this is a cake slicing exercise. If you imagine a cake, we can cut it in all sorts. We can cut it in conventional slices. We can cut it horizontally. We can stick a spoon in it and take. The way that you slice a cake has a big impact on all sorts of attributes of the pleasures of eating the cake. Not a good metaphor, I suppose. But almost instead of identifying the myths, if you identified the causes of the myths, then I feel that would be much more helpful. So you and I now have talked about several misconceptions, but I think always I've identified the misconceptions as being only misconceptions because we're not communicating well. We come from different disciplines. We haven't bothered to go back and look at the research that was done on that topic in another discipline in another period. We may, here am I again. This is an exhibition of arrogance. I'm talking to a colleague from Switzerland in English, and my colleague from Switzerland, I haven't asked Stefan, no doubt you can speak quite a few languages, and I struggle with anything other than English. But whatever language we use, we have to accept the language carries with it all sorts of inadequacies of communication. So Chet Bowers was just the most fantastic academic, I think, in terms of identifying how the language that we use, it just carries with it sort of heaps of assumptions that are shorthand, so we don't have to think about. So this is a framing concept in a way, a single word, it activates a frame in our mind. We don't have to think about it. It just comes forth. And we have huge dilemmas, but going from one language to another. And thinking that these same metaphors work in different languages, that we're activating the same frame. We're absolutely not. So to develop a typology of myths is a myth itself, unless it addresses the causes of the myths. So perhaps I would So you're slicing your cake as a dichotomy of something that either is a myth or is not a myth. I would slice the cake in relation to things that one discipline misunderstands about another discipline, and then I would have another cake slicing exercise where I would be exploring the myth of different people not being able to communicate with one another. So my experiences with my German and Scandinavian colleagues and my American colleagues, all of whom think about these things in different ways, and this is not an individual thing. I'm confident these are national traits in how they think about things. In New Zealand, I have to and am encountering different ways of thinking about things from an indigenous perspective. We have Maori people that have lived in New Zealand for quite a few hundred years. We have Pacific people that have come much more recently, and they bring with them different ways of seeing the world that have such a profound effect on whether something is a myth or not. So I'm sorry that I don't want to undermine your efforts of creating a typology of myths, but I just a request for,
I find this super valuable. That's why I'm speaking to experts like you to further enhance like the validity also of this, and to ground my research on solid argumentation and also on critical thinking. So, for instance, I would consider myself not as a person who always clearly distinguishes between myth and fact. I always think there's a continuum. And for me, it's always important to look at the consilience of evidence. Like, are there theoretical arguments? Are there empirical arguments and practical arguments? And for instance, something like learning styles, which is well researched in educational psychology, I would speak of that phenomenon. If you identify learning styles in people and give them according assignments, that they perform better. That's well researched. It has weaknesses on a theoretical level, on an empirical level, and a practical level. So I would put that rather in the direction of myth. But of course, there is debate to it, as education and psychology are often soft sciences where there's no clear wrong or right. So it's often how you do certain things. And I think there are certain phenomena that are more open to debate. And in sustainability education, if lecturer says sustainability education is just an add-on to an already overcrowded curriculum, wouldn't that be kind of a questionable belief?
Questionable belief, overcrowded curriculum. I would look at it from a different perspective and suggest that the last person, I can think of some people around me who aren't particularly keen on a sustainability transition. What I would prefer to say is that the last people to teach sustainability, if we go back to a conceptualization like greening the curriculum, why would you want somebody who doesn't have a feel for this, to be teaching young people in some way? And then you say, well, they're not teaching it. All they're doing is making sure that they raise different perspectives. So the Scandinavian sort of philosophy of pluralism, it is fantastic. It absolutely fits in with the idea of teaching people how to think, not what to think. Sweden in particular, it's really struggling, I think, because the legislation tells them all education has to educate for sustainable development, but with the emphasis on the for. And that puts teachers and university people in a very, very difficult position. But my problem there is that they're likely to do more harm than good. In some of my writing where I've explored this, I've used the phrase that I actually want my grandchildren to be taught by eco-warriors and social justice advocates, people who have their emotions on their sleeves and they live the life in an affective sort of sense. So this is Bloom's affective learning domain. These are people who characterize right at the top of the hierarchy. People are going to be teaching about sustainability or for sustainability. They're the only people that can really do it. Other people can teach critical thinking. They can teach all sorts of other things. Many academics are quite good at saying, well, look, I have this particular belief myself. I can't get away with it. I'm not going to pretend I don't have this belief. But we should look at this from this perspective and that perspective. We should challenge the assumptions that even I have. And I think this is probably good critical thinking teaching. But to put people in a position where they have to sort of teach something they don't believe in, I think it's just dreadful and can't possibly work. I don't think. And then we have solutions to it. Well, everybody who doesn't toe the line, we'll sack them, or we won't promote them. There are higher education strategies out there like this. Whole institutions become sort of focused on particular ways of doing things. And yes, academic freedom is trampled on, but institutions have every right to appoint people who they want to appoint. But we end up with an education system that's very polarized. And personally, I still doubt its effectiveness. So Plan B is, for me, the way forwards, with all its flaws or potential flaws. I'm developing more competence, that there are certain aspects of my Plan B, teaching critical thinking, that can overcome some of the issues that we have about these things. But there we go.
But for your Plan B, for critical thinking and also intellectual independence, isn't it useful maybe to discern questionable beliefs from beliefs that are backed up by good, solid science or evidence that is like the best available evidence that is there?
I think absolutely. I think there are several programs of activities that are designed to teach critical thinking. I'm quite an advocate for Brookfield's approach. It's based on hunting assumptions, and then for every one of those assumptions you've hunted, you've got to try and challenge it. You've got to look for different perspectives on that assumption. It's a stylized way of going about it. I think it's fantastic. I think more formal argumentation processes exist in more than one discipline. English language uses argumentation. We should be teaching argumentation far more than we do at present in all disciplines. For me, it's all part of critical thinking. And if we don't teach these things, it's not higher education. Higher education, I say higher education is not more education. It's higher education. It's got to be different from compulsory education.
My motivation is not to tell people what to think. I'm also for intellectual independence. To use your term, I just want to point to certain things, to maybe questionable assumptions, to sensitize people for those. It's open to them how they evaluate what my conclusions were. So I think that's maybe important also for the listeners. So, for example, I could imagine your. It's not for me to imagine your website, but again, it's a cake cutting exercise, but it's also an educational exercise. Absolutely. I'm anticipating you want people to read your webpage and to come out of it changed in some way. And for me, I think there is so much evidence that critical thinking changes people that if you stylized it as an exercise in critical thinking, this is the way that this particular discipline approaches it. What are the assumptions? Let's look at some of these assumptions. Let's hunt for the assumptions that underpin this, and then look at different perspectives on this. What does somebody from this discipline think, or somebody from an indigenous background think? And then let's look at all of these different perspectives on it, and then let's make our own mind up. What do you think about it? So, because that fundamentally, education is about learning, and learning is about change. And we want people to come out of a learning experience as changed people. Yeah, that resonates a lot with me and sounds super valuable. I already have plans for this website or whatever it's going to be. Yeah. And it should not only contain the myths in itself or the misconceptions, but also refutations where also I list, for instance, the causes, where they come from, the root, etc., what you alluded to, and the potential negative consequences and how we can deal with those things. But from your experience, what strategies have been effective in identifying, analyzing, and dispelling such assumptions?
Maybe I'm speaking before I'm thinking enough here, but on my mind there is this notion of developing measurements that work. So I did say I put a lot of effort into exploring ways to monitor how young people change in terms of, for example, their sustainability concern. And I think tools like that will help us. Right now, there's just so few evaluations of change. Just about every institution in the world has got some sort of strategy that relates to this, but virtually none of them identify ways of assessment, evaluation, monitoring, measurement, or researching change. The few, I keep a folder on my computer, and if I encounter a research paper that I think, oh, look, that's actually really good, because not only have they gone into this with some sort of outcome in mind, but they've found a way of monitoring change, very rarely on an individual basis. Quite often it's based on self-reported data, which is no doubt a flaw, but there, for me, as long as it's self-reported in an anonymous way, then I think it overcomes some of the flaws there. But my folder's only got half a dozen papers in it. And I review lots of papers. I read not lots of books. I read books when I can. There's not much evaluation going on. There's an awful lot of I don't know what to call it, but good wishes, but not an awful lot of very little evaluation going on.
I see. When we move a thematic area further, I would like to present you a few statements and would love you to indicate whether you see them as myths, which I know you wouldn't use the term, as facts, or something in between, and maybe a brief explanation of your reasoning if you like. So statement 1 would be: only lecturers who themselves think and act in a sustainable way should be allowed to train students.
So first of all, I don't think higher education is in the business of training students, but unfortunately some of higher education is. So I and a colleague explored professional education some time ago, 2018, I think. Yes, Tony Egan was the colleague that I did that with. What we were interested in there is how values education works in the professions. So as you know, most professions do have professional values. So we explored medical education, but similar work can be done in things like teaching and in engineering, wherever a profession has got a set of values. And there's no doubt that professional education departments train their students to have these values. I might think that's a terrible thing to do. They should be encouraging them to think critically about it. But actually, teaching professional values is really important to these professions. The reason I think it works is because the professional educators share these values. The professional educators don't have any problems teaching values that they share. These are, the most professional educators in the medical education departments. They're doctors themselves. Not only that, but the values that are being shared, they're all socially acceptable, valued values. They're things like honesty and sort of respect and commitment, and they're all wonderful things. People don't have any problem sharing those and teaching those and training them. Where the problem comes is where university people are expected to teach values that they don't share themselves and that aren't shared widely within society. And the sustainability values we're talking about are not shared widely in society, which is why we're talking about education for sustainable development. We're trying to change society. We're trying to use education as a social change agent. These values are not shared by society, certain individuals within society, certainly. But broadly speaking, these are alien values for society. They're alien values for the academics that exist in our universities, not for all of them, for most of them. So I think I've answered the question.
Yep. I think this directs us also to the second statement: being expected to integrate sustainability into teaching interferes with the academic freedom of lecturers. Yeah. You already mentioned that.
But it's an unreasonable expectation to expect people to do things that they don't believe in. You're just asking them to be hypocrites. It just doesn't make sense. People are forced. This is all about the neoliberal university now, and people are forced to do things that they would rather not do. Universities have got ways to force them to do all sorts of things, but most people draw a line at values education, and I can't do this. It's not. How can I drive to work in my car and fly to my conferences at the same time as trying to teach people this stuff? It just doesn't make sense.
Statement 3: the inner development goals are the new panacea.
Yeah, but again, I don't want to be disparaging about new bandwagons, and my understanding is that this is just reiterating what Bloom and colleagues did in the 1950s. Psychology is often redeveloping some of these ideas, and again, that sounds disparaging against psychology, which is a wonderful discipline. But you try and take some of these concepts and make them interdisciplinary, and they come out a bit wishy-washy, but maybe it'll work.
Yeah. sometimes these new concepts feed the appeal to the new of humans. I think humans sometimes need a new concept. It might have a positive impact.
It might, yeah.
Statement 4, the outcomes of sustainability education, for instance, environmental literacy, are too difficult to measure and assess.
Well, I don't think we should be trying to educate for anything that we can't measure or assess. And I think that does put limits on what we can educate for. But it behoves us to research these things. We're trying to do something we've not tried to do before. We're not going to do it without researching it. So personally, a big part of my plan B is all about teaching not only the skills for critical thinking, but the dispositions for critical thinking. Yeah. So there's a whole literature here on the dispositions of critical thinking. I'm quite an advocate for that. Unfortunately, it was all written in the 1980s and 1990s, but it's still very relevant now. But we don't know how to teach discipline. We don't know how to teach the dispositions to critical thinking. Yeah. We know lots about how to teach skills. But as soon as we come to that affective element, we really struggle. So we've got to research it. But no, to say that these things are too difficult to measure is just a cop-out. We shouldn't be teaching things that we can't measure.
Mm-hmm. And the last statement, sustainability education should be value neutral.
And of course, it's a silly concept. Of course, sustainability is a value-laden concept. It's impossible to address, I think, any aspect of sustainability without encountering the affective domain.
I also see it that way, but sometimes also in political education, you have faculty that says, I don't want kind of to make my hands dirty, to be value-free or to be neutral in a way. That's where that is coming from, and I see that in sustainability education as well.
But my perspective is that whether they think they're teaching values or not, they are. Yeah. Students are learning from them. Just look at the power differential, in a typical learning environment between the teacher and the student, in terms of assessment, in terms of the control these people have on not only on how the young person develops, but on the assessment of that young person and their future prospects. The power differential is huge. And to imagine there's no affective interaction there it's just ludicrous, I think.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. With that, we're already at the last thematic area, the future of sustainability education and educational myth research. What do you think, what are the most pressing questions in the future of research on questionable beliefs in and about sustainability education?
Personally, I think it's researching our practice, going through that series. We need to either assess or evaluate or monitor or measure or otherwise research what impact we're having. And if we don't do that, then any notions of change just don't make sense to me. So in terms of the most pressing question, it's well, how are we going to do that? How are we going to measure or monitor the impacts that we're having? Part of that for me is, how do we teach these things? So my assertion before that political scientists want to remain neutral, but they can't remain neutral, they're bound to have some sort of impact. We need to measure what that impact is, and we need to develop educational assessment approaches or research approaches that will allow us to make those measurements. But then we encounter this issue that so my grounded theory there is higher education is protecting its identity. University academics are found themselves in a position where they have to protect their identity. They're not prepared to research these things. And as long as they don't research them, they can get away with doing what they've always done. And I suspect society will lose patience with universities eventually. That's the pressing need. We need to research our practices far more than we do at present. Yeah. That means stopping researching everybody else's practices and setting aside 10% of our energy and our finances and anything else to research our own practices.
I like that a lot because I'm a huge advocate of scholarship of teaching and learning. I think business as usual is often not helpful when it comes to changing your own beliefs. Could you recommend any literature or resources or individuals that come to mind when you rewind what we've talked about?
Yeah, so I spent Christmas reading a book by Muonk, M-U-O-N-K, called The Identity Trap. It's essentially about social justice. I'm very interested in social justice. I think it's a key aspect of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think universities have a sort of quite a deep culpability in this area. We're a very middle-class enterprise in just about every country I've encountered. The values of the middle classes sort of, so this is Bourdieu again. We're recreating the prejudices of the society that sponsor us. Instead of challenging the prejudices, we're recreating them. There are huge class issues here and always have been, but universities are starting to focus far more on other aspects of identity nowadays than class. And I think this is a real danger. Clearly, Munch does. The identity trap is, I think, a really good exploration of these issues. And I see it around me all the time. And for me, it's a lack of critical thinking. Critical thinking is what we use to enable us to develop. So our beliefs and actions should be based on what we think rather than what others teach us. And for me, it's a lack of critical thinking. We're basing our beliefs and our actions on what we experience around us, what our parents tell us, what the society tells us, what our university professors tell us. But what we've got to do is to start thinking better for ourselves. And I think that's the only real way out of some of these things like the identity trap.
I think this is already a wonderful final word. Is there anything else you would like to point to or emphasize regarding what we've talked about?
Well, I mean, I'm researching all the time. I'm particularly interested in academic decision making right now. I'm curious about how academics are making decisions, and I'm particularly curious about academics that make contrary decisions, that make decisions that are not the sort of decisions perhaps that the university expects them to make. So here's a nod to the neoliberal world again. Academics who say, well, actually, if I make that decision, I'm probably not going to get promoted, but I'm going to make that decision anyhow. I'm interested in what supports that sort of decision and how we can encourage more people to make decisions like that, and how our higher education can be more supportive of contrary academics. So that's the research area that I'm focusing on at present. I think it's relevant to the question you just asked me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's highly interesting because those people also work on the basis or decide on the basis of beliefs, right?
Yeah.
Here would be again interesting. What beliefs do they have, and why do they decide against the mainstream, if you would call it like that? On a university level, I saw currently several universities have quit the global rankings, which you would find in a neoliberal sense is odd because you're taking yourself out of the competition with all the consequences. But I find it a very courageous and also kind of a positive development. But we have to see what comes from that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your insights. It was a pleasure to listening to you. I also really liked the critical aspects you mentioned, and I found it really fascinating. Thanks a lot. And
it was really good to meet you, Stefan, and good luck with your work.
Thank you for your interest in the Sustainability Education podcast. Did you find the insights helpful? Do you have any questions, comments, or objections? Then feel free to get in touch and share this episode with others. This podcast is produced by the Institute of Business Education and Educational Management at the University of St. Gallen. Thank you for listening and hear you in the next episode. Bye bye.